Why would you try to climb Everest? Because it's there. These three words are one of the most well-known mountaineering phrases that have ever been spoken. They originated from George Mallory, a British mountaineer that would be among the first from his country to travel to Everest and attempt to climb the world's highest peak. In 1921, Mallory had just returned to Britain after serving in World War I, where he saw a flyer advertising a climbing expedition, the first of its kind, an attempt of Everest. Mallory, having spent a semester in college on an excursion in the Alps, had developed an interest in mountain climbing and saw this as the perfect opportunity. He did not hesitate as he stepped forward and volunteered himself for the expedition. Little did he know that this chance encounter would change his life forever. This is his story. Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel where we cover all tragic and terror stories. So if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, plus ring the notification bell to be notified of all new uploads. And as always, viewer discretion is advised. Everest, located on the border of China and Nepal, had never been climbed in 1921. In fact, there had never been a documented expedition to even attempt the summit. So of course, when British mountaineers put together a small team that would be tasked to develop a plan to summit Everest, it drew attention, since at the time no explorer had been within 60 miles of the mountain. This mission was strictly a reconnaissance one. The team would take gear accordingly and be able to spend a long period of time on their journey. Nepal had closed their borders to all Westerners, and the same general practice followed in China. Therefore, the only way to even reach the vicinity of Everest had to be done by walking through Tibet. The team would first have to traverse up through the Karta Glacier, which would then grant access to cross the Lakpa La Pass, and once safely across, they would be able to descend, reaching the East Rongbuk Glacier. Finally, at this point, they would attempt to climb Everest's North Col. They were certainly realistic with the summit attempt on this expedition, and only expected to reach the North Col mark. The team did not have plans to climb higher. Instead, the emphasis was placed on understanding and mapping out the surrounding terrain. Clearly, this expedition had been well thought out and planned, and during this journey, Mallory showed enthusiasm and eagerness. It was evident he had a natural talent for this environment. Even though this was his first time in the Himalayas, he would quickly become the lead climber. Once the team had physically arrived at the location and laid eyes on the route they planned to take, they realized climbing Everest further up the North Col to the summit was not possible. It was discovered that the North Col maxes out at about 7,000 meters, and to reach the summit under this route, the team would have to make a shift to the North Ridge, valuable information that would help develop a plan for the following year. Because of this expedition, they began to understand that the best time for a summit attempt would be between April and May. Additionally, they began mapping out the terrain so they could refer back to it. The only problem was that nobody from the 1921 expedition desired to return, except for Mallory. It makes me think just what kind of conditions they must have met to deter at least 10 strong climbers. But George was different, and he swore that they had a better understanding of the route and a legitimate attempt at the summit could be made. Thus, in 1922, a small team of 13 individuals was created. They had prepared accordingly for the summit by bringing small bottles of oxygen. Similar to the last trip, they would have to reach Everest by making a trek through Tibet. To put it into perspective, the team started their trip on March 26 in Darjeeling, India. They would spend about a month carrying supplies through Tibet, alternating between horse riding and walking. The location designated for base camp, the lower end of Rongbuk Glacier, would not be reached until May 1st. Once at base camp, an extensive reconnaissance expedition was held to get an understanding of Rongbuk Glacier Valley, as well as setting up additional camps along the climb to provide supplies. An advanced base camp, or Camp 3, was set up at 6,400 meters just under the North Col. Along the way, Camp 1 at 5,400 meters was created, as well as Camp 2 at 6,000 meters. It took a week of climbing and moving supplies before each camp was properly established. There would be a push to set up Camp 4 at 7,000 meters, but doing so took a heavy toll on the team. Most members at this point were overworked and left exhausted, as much were used to hard work, but not so much the Himalayan climate. And to make matters worse, some of the team began to get sick, which quickly spread, leaving only 5 healthy climbers able to continue. Of course, as you can guess, the situation did not deter Mallory in the slightest. And on May 19th, Mallory and 3 other climbers named Somerville, Norton, and Moorshed would all set out from Camp 3 to attempt the summit. They made quick work of the mountain, and by 1 p.m. had made it past the North Col. The following day started early, as enthusiasm was high, and each climber was very excited to continue, as the anticipation of a new discovery was hard to contain. The team rushed to start their climb, but would still be delayed starting at 7 a.m. Today, the temperature was slightly colder than yesterday, and the weather became more cloudy, which caused long-range visibility to be non-existent. Their climb at this point was unknown to the group, as they had to create their own footpath through the heavy snow, and despite the enthusiasm, the conditions slowed the group down. They managed to make it to the 7,600 meter mark, which is actually a common distance to travel in one day even for today's standards. But to the team it was a disappointment, as they had set a goal of 8,200 meters. May 21st would not be any easier. A careless mistake caused a critical bag of food to fall down the mountain early in the morning, leaving a sour taste in all of the climbers' mouths. Moorshed was too tired to continue, so he began to descend alone. Mallory, Somerville, and Norton all continued climbing along the North Ridge. Almost at the upper northeast ridge, a slight snowfall had begun, causing visibility to worsen by the hour, especially at high altitudes. All members of the team had packed heavy coats, but these conditions were unfamiliar, especially to British mountaineers. As the days passed, cracks began to develop in the mental fortitude of the British team. They would turn back due to the conditions and supplies, but it was still an accomplishment. Disaster almost struck when Mallory and his team were descending. They were crossing a traverse in the dark when a climber began to fall, and in a panic, Mallory dug his axe deep into the ice, preventing the fall. The stars provided some visibility in the dark sky, but it was clearly an extremely close call, one that would not easily be forgotten. Once the team stabilized, all was fine and they continued their descent, which would be followed up by 2 other summit attempts. Neither one was successful. Mallory and the British team would again experience the dangers of Everest, and on the 3rd summit attempt, a small avalanche caused by Mallory would bury the British climbers. All of them would be fine, but the avalanche did kill 7 porters. A tragedy that would mark the end of the 1922 expedition, and one of the earliest documented incidents of climbers losing their lives on Everest. In preparation for the next expedition, the avalanche was fresh on everyone's minds, and they certainly did not want to face another disaster, so the preparations took a bit longer than the previous 2 years. The expedition would follow the same path as the 1922 trip. Porters at the time were locals from the area that would help carry supplies up the mountain. Originally, they were not seen as companions to accompany the team to high altitudes, but for the last expedition, it was clear that porters were some of the strongest climbers, and would really benefit the team if they stayed for the duration of the climb. This thought process was the early development of the system currently running under Everest today, with the Sherpas and climbers both summiting together as a team. As mentioned previously, the route the expedition team took was the same as the 1922 route. There was little that was not already known or needed to be discovered at this point. They would begin their journey in late March and not reach the base camp location where Rongbuk Glacier and Rongbuk Valley meet until the start of May. The team would begin their ascent by establishing camps along the route. Again, they repeated what they had done for the 1922 expedition, and Camp 1 was set up at 5,400 meters, Camp 2 at 6,000 meters, and Camp 3 at 6,400 meters. Once this was established, over 150 porters began carrying and supplying each camp with gear. No expense was not taken, as the British explorers desperately wanted this attempt to be successful. The winter had been rougher than the previous ones, meaning the snow was thicker on the mountain and conditions were improving at a slower pace. To make matters worse, a snowstorm came in on the exact location the team was set up. 15 climbers would become trapped, setting up Camp 4 during the storm. British climber Hazard was among the group and would lead 8 individuals down the mountain. Mallory, Norton, and Somerville, all climbers returning from the 1922 expedition, would climb Everest to Camp 4 during the snowstorm and rescue the remaining porters without incident. The porters that had the ability to climb during the storm with Hazard were nicknamed Tigers, as they show that they were strong climbers and could be included in high altitude climbs. Despite everything, the team prevailed and eventually were set up for a legitimate summit attempt. Because of the conditions and supplying every camp appropriately, a summit attempt would not be considered until June. Mallory and Bruce, the head of the expedition, would attempt the summit first and were accompanied by 9 tigers. They would start out from Camp 4 right under the North Col and would not be bringing supplemental oxygen, which is important to consider once they reach the death zone, as extended periods over 8,000 meters place tricks on your mind. The first goal was to set up Camp 5 at 7,700 meters, which would prove to be very difficult. 4 of the tigers would turn back, but eventually 2 British climbers and 5 remaining porters would make their mark and establish camp. The following day, Camp 6 was planned to be erected at 8,200 meters, but this mark would not be met, as the team would turn back from their attempt. Supplies and morale were just too low to continue. On their descent, Mallory and Bruce would pass the other 2 British climbers, Norton and Somerville, who were on their way up for their own summit attempt. They would be accompanied by 6 porters and would spend 2 days getting to the same camp Mallory and Bruce had established. Only 4 porters would reach Camp 5, and they would all climb together to establish Camp 6 at 8,170 meters, a step above Mallory and Bruce's attempt already. Once Camp 6 was supplied, all porters were sent down in fear of risking their safety considering the previous expedition. Norton and Somerville would spend the night huddled together. I can only imagine the thought process for both of them. Terrified, yet bursting with excitement, a night neither would be soon to forget, as no man had ever slept higher. They began their summit attempt in the morning at around 7 a.m. The weather was ideal and the day seemed promising, except that each British climber only had 1 liter of water to carry, a very small amount compared to today's standards, and would be seen as a health risk. The pair would also not be bringing oxygen, therefore progress was painfully slow. The climb was very rough as the terrain picked up in steepness and the snow was thick. Somerville was able to climb 200 meters above Camp 6, making it around the 8,400 meter mark before having to stop. He was exhausted and could not go any further, so it was agreed upon that he would wait for Norton to continue his climb. Norton would make it to the 8,570 meter mark, the highest mark documented at the time, only 280 meters from the summit. Norton also turned around due to the same reasons as Somerville. The terrain had become very taxing on the climber's energy, and he just couldn't continue. But just because they began their descent did not mean their troubles were over. Somerville had no water and experienced blockage in his throat, a severe problem at high altitudes, so much so that Somerville thought he was going to die. Luckily, he was able to remove the pressure with his lungs and continued the descent. They would not reach Camp 4 until 9:30 p.m. Norton did not face any troubles during his climb, but once at camp he began to have severe pain in his eyes, which led to being snowblind for 60 hours. But overall, both would survive. Once Norton had returned to camp, Mallory began discussing their experiences in an attempt to plan another climb. Bruce would be too sick to accompany Mallory, and so Sandy Irvin was selected to be Mallory's partner. Irvin was not a strong climber and had the least amount of experience than anyone else there. However, his knowledge about equipment was far above anyone else on the expedition. I think what mattered most, though, was that Mallory and Irvin got along very well. The duo would begin their climb on June 5th, accompanied by 8 porters. They would successfully reach Camp 5 the following day, June 6th, and would be stocked with over 25 pounds of food each. Half the porters were sent down to Camp 4 to lower the exposure to risk and to prevent any unnecessary accidents. The next day, June 7th, 2 porters named Odell and Knoll would climb to Camp 5 to document and support the British duo. Along the way, Odell noticed that there had been supplies left in the snow, which left a sinking feeling in his stomach. They would reach camp after Mallory and Irvin had already left. The remaining 4 porters began to prepare to leave, but right before they started their descent, they handed over 2 written notes from Mallory. Dear Odell, we're awfully sorry to have left things in such a mess. Our Una cooker rolled down the slope at the last moment. Be sure to get back to Camp 4 tomorrow in time to evacuate before dark, as I hoped to. In the tent, I must have left a compass. For the Lord's sake, rescue it. We are without. To here on the 90s atmosphere for 2 days, so we'll probably go on 2 cylinders. But it's a bloody load for climbing. Perfect weather for the job. Yours ever, George Mallory. Another note carried by the porters read, Dear Knoll, we'll probably start earlier tomorrow to have clear weather. It won't be too early to start looking out for us either crossing the rock band under the pyramid or going up Skyline at 8 p.m. Yours ever, George Mallory. The following day, June 8th, Noel would await with the telescope at Camp 3 in hopes of capturing the moment. Odell began his morning by climbing from Camp 3 to Camp 4 in preparation to support Mallory, and around 1 p.m., Odell spotted 2 climbers, just very tiny black dots moving against the snow. Based on his analysis, they were at the second step, or the 8,600 meter mark. If true, it would mark the highest point anyone had climbed so far. Odell did not have a good feeling about what he saw though. Mallory and Irvin were severely behind schedule. Nevertheless, he managed to reach Camp 6, which was a mess. Heavy snowfall began once Odell arrived, further causing worry for the British duo. He spent 2 hours waiting, calling out for Mallory, but Odell, deep down, knew it was hopeless. They had been too high up on the mountain, started their descent too late in the day, and just did not have enough supplies to survive a heavy snowfall. Odell hesitated to leave Camp 6, but knew it would be safer down the mountain. Luckily, the snowfall stopped after 2 hours and provided Odell with a small enough window to descend without incident. The following day, June 9th, Odell again awoke and climbed with 2 porters to Camp 5, where they spent the night. Odell would climb to Camp 6 alone and discovered it had not changed, indicating Mallory and Irvin did not make it back for 2 nights now. Odell would wait most of the day at camp, until the sun began to set in the afternoon, and before he descended for the night, 6 blankets were laid upon the ground in the form of a cross. The signal at the time, for no trace can be found, given up hope. On June 11th, the expedition ended. A successful summit was not documented, admittedly with a cloud of controversy. To this day, there is still a debate on if Mallory and Irvin were the first 2 people to ever summit Everest. Based on their locations last seen and the climber Mallory was, Odell and Norton fully believed that they had reached the summit, and over the years, there have been multiple expeditions to try and uncover some of the missing details of what happened to Mallory. In 1933, Irvin's ice axe was found laying on a flat piece of terrain near the first step, 8,610 meters. This was a little bit strange because the location was not one that either climber would stop and unload gear. Therefore, the consideration is that Irvin had to have dropped it, whether in an accident or needed both hands for a separate task. In 1991 and 1999, there were sets of very old oxygen bottles found at the first step. It was determined that these bottles did belong to Mallory and Irvin and further solidified the location Odell spotted them at from below. Lastly, and maybe the most telling piece of evidence, was Mallory's body found in 1999. It was evident he had experienced a fall, as one of his legs was broken, there was a large lump on his forehead, and his waist showed significant rope pulls. But perhaps one of the most interesting facts is that Mallory carried a picture of his wife with him at all times. It was severely tucked away, and the plan was for him to place that picture on the summit of Everest. That picture was not with Mallory's body, and perhaps the only remaining piece of evidence to this day that still may hold the truth is Mallory's camera. It was never found and may still be lying in the snow somewhere. Irvin's body to this day has still not been found. There's a very interesting theory that China secretly removed Irvin's body, along with the camera, so that their expedition in the 1960s was credited with the first successful summit. The reason for this was because a journalist originally leaked that a British climber's body had been found during their expedition, but this statement was retracted by the Chinese government. Additionally, multiple sources over the years have begun coming forward and claim that China removed a body from the summit of Everest and have secretly hid evidence. Mark Sennett touches on the theory and even names references in his book titled The Third Pole: Mystery, Obsession, and Death on Mount Everest. Please do your own research and determine what you think about it yourself. The 1921, 1922, and 1924 British expeditions to Everest were the earliest documented attempts to summit the world's highest peak, proving to be one of the most influential moments in the mountaineering community to this day. A story that embodies the human desire to discover the unknown, to experience something for the first time, and to ultimately have their names go down in history.